Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunchbox Talk with the North Carolina Botanical Garden and a program celebrating American Indian Heritage Month. I'm Joanna Lalikas, the Director of Education at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, and we are so excited to have you all here with us. We have a special guest today. I'd like to introduce Jessalyn Keziah with the American Indian Center here at UNC. She's the Community Engagement Program Officer, and she has just a few words of welcome for you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and hello, everyone. My name is Jessalyn Keziah. I am the Community Engagement Program Officer at UNC's American Indian Center, and I am a member of the Lumbee tribe here in North Carolina. I just wanted to say to all of you, happy American Indian Heritage Month, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the full calendar of events that's happening across UNC and across our wider community to celebrate American Indian Heritage Month. Some events are in person and some events are virtual. So no matter where you are, there may be some way to engage. And I also just want to say a word of thanks to the Botanical Garden, who have been such amazing partners of the American Indian Center and are doing a lot of work to feature Native stories and Native voices. And I hope you'll join us again tonight for another event that we'll tell you about in a moment. And with that, I'll turn it back over and I'm going to drop a link in the chat to all of the other events that we have all throughout November. And I do hope to see you at some of those too. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessalyn. The North Carolina Botanical Garden and the North Carolina Botanical Garden Foundation acknowledge that the story told about the history of the land we steward has been incomplete. Before the Morgans and Masons, these lands were home to multiple tribes and the ancestors of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, who persist locally to this day. We acknowledge the Native people today, including many UNC students, faculty, and staff who still gather, walk, hike, and engage with the habitats and gardens on this land. We recognize that at least one of the adjacent lands we steward, Mason Farm Biological Reserve, was first cleared, cultivated, and worked by Native Americans, and later by African enslaved people. We invite you to reflect on our individual and community roles and knowing the whole story about the land we each steward. So today, we are excited to bring you Dr. Dan Cobb of UNC's Department of American Studies, who will be talking with us about D'Arcy McNicoll and his garden writings. McNicoll is one of the 20th century's most important American Indian writers, intellectuals, and political actors. So we're really thrilled to have Dr. Dan Cobb with us today. For those who are new to the North Carolina Botanical Garden, we are a unit of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We hope you'll visit. If you live in the area, come by for a visit of our display gardens or our natural areas. We'd like to thank our fall 2021 Lunchbox Talk event host, Damon Waite, for supporting our fall Lunchbox Talk series at the Dogwood level. Event hosts provide funds that support program planning, accessibility, and reach of these talks. David Michaud is my partner in moderation today. He'll be assisting our speaker with Q&A.
Please, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel M. Cobb. He's a professor of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's an award-winning writer and teacher and the author of numerous books, edited volumes, articles, and the great courses devoted to Native peoples of North America. He served as the Fulbright Bicentennial Chair in American Studies at the University of Helsinki in 2017 and 2018, and as a visiting researcher at University of Tübingen in Germany in 2019. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. This particular project has its roots in his tenure as Assistant Director of the D'Arcy McNicoll Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois. Thank you for joining us today, Dan. If you want to share your video quickly so that folks can see you. We are not going to be able to see Dan's video during the lecture, unfortunately, but he has a fantastic presentation for us today. So I'll stop sharing my screen and let him take things away.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to begin by saying, well, to reinforcing and reaffirming the land acknowledgement that was shared by Joanna and that while I also acknowledge that North Carolina University stands on the ancestral homeland of Eastern Siouan peoples, I want to reinforce that I acknowledge also and strive to honor the commitment to serve the citizens of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the Coharie Indian tribe, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, the Halawa-Saponi Indian tribe, the Saponi, the Meherrin Nation, the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, and the Waccamaw-Siouan tribe, who, and this is important to me, along with the citizens of other tribal nations, comprise the largest population of indigenous people in any state east of the Mississippi River. And it's important for me, as we also heard from Joanna, that it's not enough just to acknowledge the land, but to reflect on and take action regarding what that acknowledgement means, the implications of acknowledging indigenous land and persistence. So thank you, first of all, to all of you for coming, to Claire Lorch, who's been an important collaborator on this project from the very beginning and a huge supporter of it, as well as Joanna Massey Lalikas and David Michaud, who I've just met for the first time today, and am so thankful for the help that he's providing behind the scenes here. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to my presentation now, and we'll get started. And we had hoped that you'd be able to see my video camera here embedded in the presentation, but that seems not to be working for us. So let me go ahead and head over to the PowerPoint presentation. Now you're looking at D'Arcy McNicoll, as was mentioned previously, one of the most important American Indian thinkers, intellectuals, writers, and political actors of the 20th century. And I want to tell you a little bit about how his life has sort of been imagined in the past, and how reading his diary and his garden writing specifically caused us to revisit some of what we thought we knew and think differently about his life. So here's a basic outline for what I'd like to share with you today. First of all, I want to tell you, as I mentioned, a bit about who D'Arcy McNicoll was. And then to understand the significance of his gardens and of his garden writing, we need to think about what settler colonialism is, how settler colonialism relates to indigenous land, historically and in the present, and then turn specifically to the connections between settler colonialism and D'Arcy McNicoll's life, his diary, and then ultimately within that, his garden writing. And all of this sort of then causes us to step back, one would hope anyway, what I'm going to suggest today, and ask, when is a garden more than a garden? And I guess here's the first question I would have for all of you, for those of you, well, who keep a diary, or those of you who garden, why do you do what you do? What meanings do you assign to that garden, what you grow, how you grow it, and what you harvest from it? So what meaning does it have for you? And I think just asking a simple question like that leads us into a really complex discussion of the various functions that gardens actually serve. And so this garden is not to be taken for granted in the least, I want to suggest, in the life of D'Arcy McNicoll. And indeed, what I think it ultimately tells us, and why I'm developing the context the way that I am, is that it tells us a lot about indigenous encounters with settler colonialism itself. It tells a surprising story, I think, about those encounters. So let me start then by just sharing a little bit about who D'Arcy McNicoll was. The last image you saw in this one come courtesy of the Newberry Library itself, where D'Arcy McNicoll's papers reside and where you can find his diary. I've just mentioned he's a luminary, a really important intellectual figure in Native America. And the path that he traveled to that point is really an unlikely one. His life's course carried him from his birth on the Flathead Reservation in Montana in 1904. And I'll mention this in a little bit more detail, but then, he becomes a sojourner. He goes to off-reservation boarding schools. He attends college in Montana. His love of literature then carries him to Europe for a time. And at the point that he leaves Montana in 1925, he never really comes back to the Flathead Reservation again, certainly not to live, and he only visits a couple of times. And so he becomes a kind of sojourner, a person who has to renew and remake his sense of place wherever he goes. And that's a little bit of foreshadowing with the garden. But along the way, he winds up writing, and he dreamed of being a writer. His life takes a very different course during the Great Depression, but he always wanted to pursue a career as a writer. And his first novel has become a classic within American Indian literature. It's called The Surrounded, and it was published in 1936. He followed that with a book that is cast as for being targeted toward young adults, but really rewards any reader, called Runner in the Sun in 1954. And then posthumously, his third novel, Wind from an Enemy Sky, was published in 1978. Now, in addition to that, D'Arcy McNicoll amassed a pretty impressive publication record that included short stories, scholarly articles, and multiple works of history, all in and around Native America, specifically the Flathead Reservation, Montana, and other aspects of his life experience, really. I mentioned that his life took a bit of a different course. Well, the Depression hit, and his career as a writer, even though he published The Surrounded in 1936, really had to become secondary to, well, really just putting food on the table. And he took a job with the federal government, working for what's called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the federal government's agency that serves as the headquarters for its relationship with tribal communities, federally recognized tribal communities. And basically his life went down this sort of policy and politics track from that point forward, even as he kept sort of trying to write and stay in touch with that side of who he was. In 1944, he became one of the founders of the National Congress of American Indians, a pan-tribal organization that continues to be really influential in American Indian politics today. He was also one of the early visionaries of that organization, and he articulated something called the American Indian Point 4 program. This was drawing from U.S. International policy, foreign policy, towards so-called developing nations, and it was geared toward the words they would have used at the time in the 1950s would be modernization or development, but ultimately this morphs into nation building. And so D'Arcy McNicoll was one of the early visionaries who said that the United States federal government should approach tribal communities as emerging nations. And that's a really important concept that he articulated at that time, and has become central, as you know, to federal Indian relations even to today. In the 1950s, he started an organization called American Indian Development. And American Indian Development carried forward that vision through local collaborations with tribal communities and also with young people. D'Arcy McNicoll spent his life in a very real way as an educator, both as an administrator of American Indian Development, but then ultimately as a teacher in college classrooms. By the end of his life, he had been appointed the inaugural director of what is now called, being named after him, the D'Arcy McNicoll Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And that's where I encountered his diary. So I became the assistant director of the D'Arcy McNicoll Center right after I finished grad school. And while I was there, I had already been writing in and around American Indian politics in what I called the early Cold War period. But it's there that I started reading his diary. And it's there that I started to realize just how valuable this diary was, despite the fact, as we'll talk in a minute, that it had essentially been dismissed by other scholars. So that in a really tiny nutshell is the contours, the overarching contours of D'Arcy McNicoll's life. Let me switch now to that second point, which is, what is settler colonialism? These concepts are really important, and I want to make sure that we wrap our heads around them. Settler colonialism is distinct from what we might think of as classic colonialism, because the newcomers, right, the settlers, purport or attempt to become the new natives And in order for that to happen, indigenous people have to be erased or eliminated. So the objective of settler colonialism, which is distinct from sort of classic colonization, is what the anthropologist Patrick Wolf calls the intention of destroying to replace. So destroy that which is indigenous, replace it with that which is new, which is the settler. And the settlers in time come to think of themselves as the native peoples. Now, there are all kinds of examples of how this plays out, including sports teams, which we just saw in the World Series with the Atlanta team. What we might think of is this is an act of appropriating an indigenous identity. So settler colonialism is a process. It is a structure, a relationship, not just a single event that happens and it's over, but is ongoing and is very much ongoing in the present, in which settlers seek to destroy that which is indigenous and to replace it with something else. It is therefore, and this is all the language of Patrick Wolf, which I find very compelling, settler colonialism is predicated on what he calls the logic of elimination. And these are difficult concepts, I think, to have to confront and to have to deal with, but I think that they really speak truth to the history of colonization and also, as we're going to see here, the remarkable nature of indigenous persistence in spite of it. Now, this process of destroying and replacing can also be thought of in terms of worlding. And to understand that concept, I want to just highlight the work of Gayatri Spivak. And Gayatri Spivak talks about this idea of worlding as a process of unmaking and remaking. And destroying and replacing is that process of unmaking and remaking an indigenous world. What winds up happening over time is that settler colonialism, and she's not writing about Native North America, but I think her ideas transfer effectively into this context. Settler colonialism ultimately, insofar as it is unfinished, and it is predicated on this idea that there are two worlds that are irreconcilable and that cannot coexist in perpetuity, right? So that is to say, there is an indigenous world, an Indian world, and there is a non-indigenous, often read as white world. And these two worlds cannot be reconciled with each other. But even more than that, the Indian world ultimately has to become erased or destroyed over time. Now, Gayatri Spivak is critical of that process, and she's saying the very creation of that concept of an indigenous world and a non-indigenous world is a function itself of settler colonialism or classic colonialism too. A few other extra concepts that help us unpack this and that we're going to use to understand what's so remarkable about Darcy McNicol's diary come from scholars like Kevin Brunel, Paige Raybon, and Philip Deloria. Kevin Brunel talks about this creation of worlds, this worlding process, and the attempt on the part of settler colonialism to destroy and replace as incorporation. So Native American, in other words, needs to be drawn into, incorporated, and ultimately overwhelmed by that which seeks to replace it. And in so doing, indigenous presence is to be erased. Now, Brunel is most well known for his concept of the third space of sovereignty, which emphasizes that while this is the goal of settler colonialism, it is not a goal that is realized, right? That settler colonialism is an unfinished project, and that is because of indigenous resistance and persistence. Paige Raybon and Philip Deloria add into these concepts some of the consequences of worlding and what has happened as a consequence of the creation of these notions of binaristic worlds, that which is sort of self-contained and Indian and something else that's self-contained and is so-called white, are these binaries of authenticity. And if you have two irreconcilable worlds, you can't move between them, right? If they can't be reconciled, you can't sort of live holistically within all of them. So you couldn't draw yet another world around them, in other words, and say that we inhabit these spaces together in our own ways. And instead, Paige Raybon and Deloria show us how Native people get subjected to binaries of authenticity that create a kind of what they call catch-22, which is to be Indian is to be vanishing. It is to be of the past. It is to be static. It is to be anti-modern. To be white is the inverse of all of those things. And what this creates is a kind of impossibility of indigenous people being so-called modern people, indigenous communities being communities with futures and presents. And this is a really pernicious construct that, again, what I want to suggest, Darcy McNichol's diary and his gardening problematizes and really undermines. And so what we need to do as we look at Darcy McNichol's life and his garden, his diary writing in general, is refigure what expectations one should have about indigeneity itself. And to see that things which don't meet our expectations or mainstream expectations, as it were, not our, but mainstream expectations, are not anomalous. They don't prove the rule. In fact, they cause us to revisit expectations about indigenous people, indigenous presence and presence at the same time. So a little more about that as we move forward, but I want to get these concepts under our belt. But let's look at how settler colonialism then actually relates to the land. And I'm guessing that for a lot of you, the map that you're seeing here is one that is familiar. This is a map that charts the multiple removal routes, the Trail of Tears, the Trails of Tears that were experienced by the Cherokee Nation in the late 1830s and 1840s. Settler colonialism, in its attempt to destroy and replace, displaces, right? Literally, and I hyphenate that, displaces indigenous peoples. It uproots and moves in an attempt to destroy and replace. So removal in the 19th century, and of course, removals are happening all across Native America before capital R removal begins, and also for decades, and even one could argue a century after removal, that removal ends. We can look at reservation making itself as an example of how settler colonialism relates to indigenous land. This is a map that shows you in gray tribal land ownership by decade and how tribal land ownership is being dissolved. And it's being dissolved in these maps through a number of different functions, one of them being reservation making, but allotment is a part of the story as you get into the 1890s and after too. But what you're seeing, again, is a displacing, a containing, a surrounding and incorporating of indigenous land, indigenous polities, indigenous peoples over time. And it is a dramatic, as you can see, a collapse of the tribal land base by the time you get to the latter half of the 19th century. And of course, there is a story east of the Mississippi, which is ongoing even in this era, of a similar process of dispersion, collapse, and of course, ethnogenesis and persistence in the recreation of indigenous peoplehood. Here's a map that shows you what allotment is doing. Now, allotment was an attempt to, in the mind's eye of Indian policymakers, solve, and I put that in quotation marks, the so-called Indian problem, which was the persistence of reservations, right? So you have the dismantling of ancestral homelands and the establishment of reservations. In the wake of that, for land-hungry settlers, you have to now dismantle, that wasn't enough, and you have to dismantle the reservations themselves. This is an example of the Ponca Reservation in Oklahoma Territory. The Ponca people, their ancestral homeland is in and around the Niagara River in Nebraska and South Dakota. They were forcibly removed from their homelands. They reestablished themselves on a reservation in Oklahoma, only, as you see here, to have that allotted basically in its entirety, 101,000 acres. So here again, we have displacement we have incorporation of indigenous people and land into this settler colonial whole with an eye toward destroying and replacing indigenous presence. Assimilation, and especially, well, not especially, but we see it in the news today in and around the off-reservation boarding schools that were created during the late 1870s and on into the early part of the 20th century. What this map is showing you is the location of the off-reservation boarding schools that were established in the present-day United States. Well, of course, these boarding schools have in common with each of these other examples the displacing of indigenous people, right, from their homeland. So the idea here is to take children from their families, from their homes and their communities, and to move them far away. And this is the off-reservation part. These are also, and the boarding part of this, and to keep them in those places so that they can't be socialized so into tribal communities. They can't learn their languages. They don't get introduced into the ceremonial cycle, the sacred cycle of being who they are, right? And so the idea of doing that is captured in the concept of assimilation. And assimilation purports to replace one identity with another one. So again, this is consistent with those core principles of settler colonialism that we've been introduced to. A final example, just to show you how persistent this is, I wanted to jump forward into the 1950s now and show you a map of relocation. It's called urban relocation. Again, in the 1950s, and it continues into the 60s and after. But what this map is showing you is a story very similar to removal, reservation making, and the off-reservation boarding schools, which is the displacement of indigenous people from their homes. And these arrows are just showing you, and it's painting with very broad strokes, obviously, but what it's really showing you is the federal government was intentionally encouraging Native people to move far away from their home communities to restart their lives in urban centers. But again, the arrows show you, so for Ojibwe people in Minnesota or Wisconsin, right, the sites, the primary destinations were not meant to be Minneapolis and Milwaukee. Those do become sites, but they weren't the prioritized ones. Instead, it's Oakland, it's San Francisco, and it's San Jose. So we have this kind of atomizing of the indigenous center, as it were, at the heart of all of these examples. And that is fundamental to settler colonialism. And it is fundamental to the life trajectory of Darcy McNicoll. So what's going on here? What are you doing to cultures, to peoples, to polities that are land-based? Well, I think that this picture here really speaks volumes to that. Prior to coming to North Carolina, I taught at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And during my time there, there was an event that was held to commemorate, to memorialize, not just Miami removal from the Great Lakes region, but the ongoing persistence of the Miami Nation. And at one event, it was sponsored by the Art Museum, a big art exhibit featuring historical images and maps, but also contemporary art and the like. People from all the places that became Yamiongi, or the place where Miami culture is practiced, came to Ohio. And because of forced removal, the Miami people wound up living and reconstituting their communities in Illinois, in Ohio, in Indiana. Then some were forcibly removed, others stayed, to the Kansas territory, only to be removed again with some staying and some going to the Indian territory, to Oklahoma. And the point of this box is that contemporary Miami people took earth from all the places that have become home and they brought them all to Oxford, Ohio, and they put them in this box. And so the box with the earth in it tells us two stories. It tells us the story of settler colonialism's penchant to erase, to eliminate, to destroy and replace, and the refusal of indigenous peoples to allow that to happen. And that's the transition I want to make then into the life of D'Arcy McNicoll, his diary, and ultimately his garden writing. So what are the connections between settler colonialism and D'Arcy McNicoll, his diary, and garden writing? Well, D'Arcy's mother was Métis. So the Métis people are a product of ethnogenesis primarily. The Métis emerged as a people through the sexual relations between French traders and Cree people. And over time, these interactions ultimately became the core of an emergent Métis identity. And the Métis people are recognized as an Indian people today. Well, D'Arcy's mother was Métis. Their family had to flee Canada during an era of war, and they relocated to the Flathead Reservation in Montana in the late 19th century. And so the map that you're looking at in the bottom left there shows you the ancestral lands of the peoples that would come to live as confederated tribes on the Flathead Reservation. And then it shows you in the darker shaded area, the Flathead Reservation itself. So this is an example, in other words, of reservation making. Then on the right, what you're seeing is the Flathead Reservation proper, but mapped here are the allotments that were carved out of it through the process of allotment itself. That's where D'Arcy McNicoll's life literally begins. D'Arcy McNicoll was born in the mission town of St. Ignatius, which is basically the administrative center of the Flathead Reservation, the same year that the US Congress passed the Flathead Allotment Act in 1904. The ancestral lands of the peoples, the Salish, Pend Oreille peoples who will inhabit the Flathead Reservation, that land base constituted, before the reservation was made, some 20 million acres. At the Treaty of Hellgate in 1855, that land base that you're seeing in the lighter gray was reduced to about 1.25 million acres. Okay, that's the destroying and replacing, part one. That was followed by allotment, right? The further dissolution of the reservation. And through allotment, the Flathead Reservation, between its creation in 1855 and 1922, when the second wave of allotments took place, was reduced from 1.25 million acres of tribally owned land to 245,000 acres. So you've got to wrap your head around how D'Arcy's world, as it were, was collapsing around him even as he was coming of age. 20 million acres reduced to 1.25 million acres, reduced to 245,000 acres. And then the allotments themselves, which are privately owned by Indian people, many of them are going to be lost. And that's what this map on the right is charting for you. The rich land that is along the river valley that runs through the center of this reservation winds up being homesteads for non-Indian people who will swiftly outnumber American Indians within the boundaries of the Flathead Reservation. Meanwhile, Native people, the Salish and Kootenai peoples of the Flathead Nation, will get marginalized literally and figuratively here, pushed out to what essentially is the land leading up, the rocky, less fertile land leading up to two mountain ranges that surround this reservation, the Bitterroot and the Mission Range. So D'Arcy is born into a world that's collapsing around him, that settler colonialism is destroying. And it remakes the world right? This process of worldling that he lives in. What you're seeing here on this slide are just images of what that would have looked like to Darcy McNichol, who was 6 years old, right? This flood of homesteaders, white people coming in to lay claim to native land as it's being dissolved and redistributed, as the reservation's being incorporated into this larger body politic. And then in the bottom, you see a typical native farmer's home in the Mission Valley, as native people are being marginalized into this less fertile land. Here in the center is an image of the Salem Indian Industrial School, later known as the Chemawa Indian School. This in Oregon, Salem, Oregon. This is where Darcy McNichol will be sent to go to school. He begins at a mission school on the reservation, run by Jesuits. He is then sent to Oregon, an off-reservation boarding school for a time. And then his family sort of is displaced during World War I and after they move, and he winds up going to public school in Portland, I believe it is, and then finishes back in Missoula, Montana. So he is subjected to all of these classic examples of allotment, of assimilation, of erasure, right? The whole logic of elimination, powerfully visiting his life. So much so that when he decides to go to college, he goes to the University of Montana, and I'll show you that in a second too. By the time he's in college, he never graduates. He gets to his senior year, but he decides he wants to go study literature at Oxford University. And how are you going to pay for that? Well, what he decides to do, and what the map, I'm going to put it back up, so if you didn't see me at it, you can see me at it now. I've overlaid the government map of the allotment of the Flathead Reservation over the one you were looking at previously. And so that fits as close as I could get it to exactly where it should be, in other words, as an overlay. That tiny red mark right there on that map that I just added, that is Darcy McNichol's allotment. And he sold it. He sold it to pay to go to Oxford University to finish his college education, get his degree, and I think leave and never come back to Flathead. So settler colonialism just potently remakes Darcy McNichol's world, his life and possibilities. It's at this point then I want to turn to the life of paper, and I'm taking inspiration from a really powerful book by a scholar named Sharon Luck called The Life of Paper. She's talking about prison writing and how prisoners seek to reclaim a sense of themselves through the letters that they write home and out to others. I think that similar dynamic is at play with Darcy McNichol and the way that he writes his diary. So I want to look at the life of paper, but his life on paper. So as I mentioned, he enrolls at the University of Montana in the early 20s. I mentioned that he petitions and ultimately sells his allotment to travel to Europe and study at Oxford. It's a disaster. It's not what he thought it would be. He winds up leaving and not finishing. He spends time in France, in Paris, and in Grenoble, sort of just, I think, exploring the literary haunts of those places and seeking out the culture, the literary culture that he sought to emulate, the sort of lost generation of writers and the Bohemians and whatnot. When he comes home in 1925, in 1926, he goes to New York, spends a little bit of time in Philadelphia as a car salesman, and then it goes back to New York to pursue this career of becoming a writer. And he works for publishers as an editor, and he's finishing what will become his first novel and trying to get his break. He lives in Greenwich Village, the heart of Bohemian culture in New York City, in Manhattan. And that's where I want to transition into sort of how people, scholars in the past, have made sense of his life. Well, as I mentioned, Darcy is best known for the novels that he has written. Those novels are often thought of as being either autobiographical or more commonly semi-autobiographical. And because of that, a lot of literary scholars basically argue that the protagonists in particular, are sort of Darcy's life on the page. And the stories that he tells, they understand to be stories of people searching for their identity as they're trapped between two worlds. Now, identity is an important theme, and it is one not to be taken for granted, okay? But the framing of it in such simplistic and binary terms is problematic. And what has happened with scholars writing about his life only through his literature, his published novels in particular, is that it reifies this notion of this permanent ossified binary that pits that which is coded as Indian versus that which is coded as white, and does not allow for any complexity or spaces in between. So the question that I ultimately had when I went to the Newberry and I really started diving into his diary and reading it and realizing that it really has something to tell us is, what else is there to know about McNicoll? What else was he trying to tell us in other forms of writing that he engaged in? And what I found is that the diary tells vastly different stories, not a story, but all kinds of stories. But it's for this very reason that it's overlooked and dismissed by scholars, has been by past scholars, because the diary doesn't tell the same story that they believe his novels tell. And I would argue that understanding the diary calls us upon us to reread the novels, see them differently too. But because his diary didn't tell the same story in more detail, in personal ways than his novels did, people basically wrote the diary off and didn't use it. And it's his garden writing in particular that I believe is the reason why, and one person literally used this phrase with me, folks say that there's nothing there. That is to say, there's no reason to read the diary. There's nothing in it that helps us understand anything of significance. Well, one of the main reasons is because there is so much garden writing in it. He talks about gardening in great detail all the time in this diary. The diary starts, the part we still have, the extant part, starts in 1930, and it goes all the way up into 1971. There's quite a few gaps in between there. And I don't even know why there are years of his life missing, but there are. But this is this massive body of him writing himself into the world through these pages that has been totally ignored. And it's been ignored because of, in large measure, I think, because of the garden writing. Well, instead of saying there's nothing there, I started asking, what is the there that is there, right? What's the there that is there? And ultimately, this leads us back to the title of the talk and this question that I asked all of you to sort of wrap your heads around, which is, when is a garden more than a garden? Well, here's what I found. A garden is about more than a garden when it provides a window on a variety of different processes that help us understand indigenous encounters with settler colonialism. Garden writing, I argue, and you're seeing a page of the diary, by the way, here on the right. This is from 1962. It's a later one and the highest resolution image I could share with you. This gives you a sense too of just how hard it is to transcribe all of this. His handwriting is just really bad, but we soldiered on anyway. A garden is more than a garden when it provides a window on a person engaged in a complex process of re-indigenizing spaces that have been radically transformed by settler colonialism. And that's what I think a Flathead person planting a garden outside of Washington, D.C., while they're working for the federal government is doing, right? He's reclaiming a space on his own terms, in this case. It provides a window on the remaking of a sense of place in the wake of being profoundly displaced by settler colonialism. So D'Arcy McNicoll lost his reservation homeland to allotment. He lost his allotment to pay for college. When he went to Oxford, he left his home. But does that mean he lost his sense of place as an Indigenous person? He lost a sense of home in its entirety? And I would argue that he, like so many other Indigenous people, didn't. Instead, they remake a sense of place. And a garden I argue, is one way in which he does that. It's one part of a larger process of remaking one's own world. And that's what I mean by this next point, the remapping of what constitutes the indigenous world. This causes one to ask fundamental questions. Where do American Indian people live? You know, why is it that we assign authentic Indian communities only often, and I'm speaking sort of in this general kind of mainstream understanding, non-indigenous mainstream understanding, we think of indigenous worlds as being synonymous with reservations. That's not true. The majority of American Indian people do not live within reservation communities. So where are these indigenous worlds? And how do indigenous people engage in world making? Well, Darcy McNichol is doing that as he's writing about the diary. That's what he's doing. He's reconstituting an indigenous world on his own terms. And in so doing, this brings us back to Deloria and Raybon and others. I believe that Darcy McNichol is refusing to live his life according to these binaries of authenticity that would consign indigenous people to particular places, to particular times, as well as ways of thinking and being, right? So he is living outside of non-Indian expectations for Native people. Whether he realizes it or not, or is self-conscious or is political about doing it, that is what he is doing. And the diary, and especially the garden writing in this instance, is one mode through which he is doing that. And we can talk about, I'll show you some pictures of the garden that we planted, taking inspiration from Darcy's writing. It defies the expectations you would have of what an Indian garden should look like, I think. So, but we'll get to that here in a minute. A garden is more than a garden when it provides a window on the rewriting of a person's sense of self into the world. You know, non-Native policymakers in the late 19th century and in the 20th century, and we can argue even today, many of them didn't believe that Native people had a place in the world as it was being made, right? That is the very driving force behind settler colonialism. That's the logic of elimination. Well, Darcy McNichol, despite that, was continually rewriting himself in the world. He was planting roots of his own. And in so doing, he was forging a resilient sense of presence, of belonging to a place, even if it isn't Flathead and his allotment, and of home. Again, despite settler colonialism's cruel intentions of destroying to replace. And then it's a window also on an indigenous refusal, and all of these add up to this point, an indigenous refusal of settler colonial worldings of the world. And then I would take a step beyond that and say that his garden writing and his diary in general, it opens windows on all kinds of aspects of his experiential world, what he did on a day-to-day basis, how he felt, what he saw, what he listened to, the places that he went, what he read. And it just explodes these oversimplified ideas about indigenous people's experiences, in this case, through the better part of the 20th century. So here I want to acknowledge the extraordinary work that was done and the partnership we had with the Carolina Community Garden, but the extraordinary work done by a group of undergraduates who formed an undergraduate research consultant team supported by the Office of Undergraduate Research. And a thank you to Boots Quimby, who oversees that program. You're seeing in the top image in the foreground there, Samara Ari Perez Labra. And then in the image below, you see Mackenzie Kalura Rep on the left and Gabby Walton on the right. They helped me transcribe the diary, and they came up really with the idea of recreating Darcy McNichol's garden. So we wanted to replant this garden as a way of reimagining Darcy McNichol's experiential world. And so on the right, what you're seeing is the early design plan that Claire helped us map out using a list of all the things that Darcy McNichol planted. And up in the right-hand corner is the focal point. I'm going to start adding pictures of, hold on. Oh gosh, I went backwards. Sorry about that. I'm going to start adding images of the garden. Yeah, here we go. So up in the top right-hand corner, you can see we planted collards, turnips, green onions, Chinese cabbage, beets, carrots, spinach, some pansies, lettuce, and Swiss chard. All of that went into the garden there. And here you're seeing the garden in its early stages. We were preparing the garden on the left over there, and you're seeing it in its earlier phases in these images. Is a massive project involving not just the research team, but volunteers at the Carolina Community Garden as well. And this garden just took off. It became just really extraordinary. And as you know, I'm sure the Carolina Community Garden gives back, just as Darcy McNichol devoted his life to giving back through community engaged work. What was grown in this garden was then redistributed to people in need. We call this temporary exhibit More Than a Garden. And I want to invite you, you'll see there are some markers there, but they don't have the posters on them yet. This is an image I think I probably took in a series of images I took in November, I'm guessing. It could have been, no, it's probably early. I don't even know when it was. But the point being that I went out and then put up the posters that we recreated. So there's actually an exhibit there that you can use to really engage in not just the garden and the planting of it, but all the other ways in which Darcy McNichol's diary provides a window into his experiential world. And then that in turn led to a Google Earth exhibit, which I'd be happy to share a link with you so you can check it out, where we recreated a trip that he wrote about taking. And it has less to do about gardening than it does about place and placemaking and what he saw and heard when he went out to the Southwest in 1942. And then an entire website called The Experiential World of Darcy McNichol. It was important to us, and it was really revealing to understand what the garden meant to Darcy McNichol via recreating the garden itself, to make things grow, to cultivate them, to work with them, and ultimately to harvest them. Made all of us think very differently about what meanings McNichol may have assigned to the gardens that he was writing so extensively about. So I want to leave the last 15 minutes or so, or with the time that we have, to I've talked for 45 minutes. I see that we're running close on our hour. I just want to take a step back and offer a last word, and that is that what you're looking at here is a person who is a writer, but much more than just a writer of novels. I see him through his diary as a kind of textual cartographer who, in his writings and in the gardens that he planted, was remapping a sense of Indigenous personhood, of experience and spatial geography itself, where Indigenous people live, where Indigenous spaces are located, with his words. And that in turn makes him an anti and decolonial intellectual. Frantz Fanon is one of the most famous anti-colonial thinkers. And I have a quote here from Frantz Fanon in which he writes, "In the world I am heading for, I am endlessly creating myself." And I wanted to juxtapose that with this excerpt from Darcy McNichol's garden writing, because in its own way, I think it speaks directly to the spirit of Frantz Fanon's quote. He says, "I finished planting for now. 2 more rows of beans, half rows of tombola," and we couldn't figure out what that next one was. That's a story. I can talk about the process of trying to figure out his inscrutable inscriptions. "Stakes for tomatoes, rotenone on beans and cabbages, iris in bloom, spaded bed for gladiola. Ate first lettuce and spinach. I replanted some chard and lettuce. I put out the garlic sets. Our peony plant finally bloomed. It's a beautiful white head." So I want to end there because that is an excerpt from garden writing that speaks to a person endlessly in the process of creating themselves, despite their encounters with ongoing encounters with settler colonialism.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. This is fantastic. Right now we just have one question, but we'll run the Q&A until about 1:05, just to give folks a few minutes to put questions in. Our first question did Darcy McNichol actually have a physical garden, and where was that located, if so?
That's a great question. Everywhere he went, everywhere he went, he remade a sense of home, a sense of place through the garden. I mean, that's what I would argue. And this is, it would be fun to talk about why people garden, right? What they invest as meaning into what they're doing. When he was in New York, he had flowers. He was in Greenwich Village, but actually a friend of mine went and took a picture of, it's 41 Commerce Street in Greenwich Village. There's a space for a garden there. He moves to DC when he starts working for the federal government. And that excerpt that I just shared from you is about the garden he planted there. When he moves, ultimately he'll move to Boulder, Colorado, and then down to New Mexico, where he lives out the rest of his life, planted gardens there as well. So those gardens were ways in which he remade his own sense of place on his own terms everywhere he went.
Great answer. Thank you for that. Could you tell me how long the temporary exhibit at the CCG is going to be there?
Well, that's a great question. You know, it is temporary, but we're going to weave it into a spring class. So I'm teaching a class called Digital Native America in the spring, and part of that class is going to engage Darcy's diary and will tie into the garden. So I'm expecting that it will be there all through the spring semester at the very least. And, you know, as long as it's useful, I'd love for it to be there, and it will live on in virtual spaces after that, actually. But what we're hoping to do, if we can make this happen, it would be wonderful, is to have an on-site visit of the garden in the spring once we get a chance to get it planted and things growing again.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to work with you on moving that forward.
Yep.
But for the folks at home, if you do want to get a sneak peek at the exhibit, you have a chance if you want to volunteer at the Carolina Community Garden. It's located off of Wilson Street and right near downtown Chapel Hill off UNC's campus. And Joanna just posted a link in the chat. Thank you for that. I am not seeing any additional questions. This presentation was fantastic in that you covered so much and left not too much unsaid. So I'll invite Joanna back on just for some parting words.
Dan, thank you so much. This was really fantastic. I appreciate it and learned so much. And we do invite you to join a work day at the Carolina Community Garden this fall or winter, and you can see the McNichol Garden at that point in time. And as David mentioned, we'll be working with Dan and Claire, the manager of the Carolina Community Garden, to offer some tours there in the spring. And again, thank you, Dan.